Well, how resilient is it if the residents are going to be taken to the hospital in a rowboat?
So my sense or my understanding is that even if we get our act together to deal with climate change, we still have a big adaptation challenge ahead of us.
Yeah, I would say it's hard for us to even imagine the scale of what needs to be done. We're locked into the trajectory of climate change for, probably at least the next 40 years. And even then, we're not even locked in at that, the current risk arc, right? Because there's some cascading events that will still occur as the climate continues to warm.
When we think about the way we build our buildings or where we put our buildings, what are sort of the basic things that need to be done?
Often we talk about climate adaptation in terms of protection, accommodation, and retreat, right?
Okay.
What structures can we protect? Are there things where we can accommodate the changing climate by just changing the way we build something? Like, for example, can we still build where it's going to flood, but we just put everything on stilts? And then retreat is this concept that we move out of the danger areas.
I feel like the word retreat is not a very American idea.
I was in New York State on Long Island after Hurricane Sandy, and that storm created catastrophic damage in the area. One of the things I see in all these reports there were just so many of these really glossy, really high quality reports that came out of New York City. They all presented the storm as this Frankenstein anomaly. And then they presented the city, first responders, and just the citizens as Ford trucks. And so I was presenting on that, and I was like, one of the critiques I have here is this is so misleading. We know it's going to happen again. And the city is tougher than weather, right? Which it's the city is at sea level rise. And this woman who was in the back of the room got up and she was like, I was the lead lawyer on this such and such thing, committee. And she goes, what are we supposed to tell people? We're fucked? I was like, well, it'd be honest. And anyway, so that's retreat, right?
What about barricade? That's not that American, but it's less un-American than retreat.
Well, barricade is kind of the problem because barricade is that we can build a levee, right? So that's actually if thinking back to kind of some of the greatest fails, one of the first things that comes to mind for me is the approach that the U.S. federal government took in the late 1800s and the early 1900s to just catastrophic flooding that just kept recurring in the Mississippi Delta region. And the U.S. took a approach there to it actually sent out these survey teams. One survey team came back and said the best way to handle this is to have a policy which we're going to call the levees only policy. The idea was that levees would be built along the entire lower Mississippi River, and that these levees would make it so that when floodwaters came, they were channeled and shot down the center of the river. And by doing that, the center of the river, I keep calling it a liver, would be carved out and the river would become deeper, which would be great because then more ships could pass on it. So it would have this double whammy benefit.
Did it work?
Project was completed around 1926, and in 1927 we had the Great Flood. Because of the way the levees did channel water down the river, when they were breached, it wasn't just a river overflowing into a delta, it was a waterfall more than 100 feet high over the top of levees, crashing down onto the delta. The Mississippi River became more than 100 miles wide. And I'm not kidding. The Mississippi River became more than 100 miles wide.
The Mississippi River became 100 miles wide?
Yes. This flood happened in the spring. The floodwaters didn't recede till the end of the summer, right? 7 states were flooded. It's called the Great Flood for a reason.
Do you see examples of people still being in denial in the way they're building?
I would say that there's not just examples, that is the norm. in the placement of buildings, not necessarily the design of buildings. What happened during Sandy is, buildings may have survived, but people were stuck in those buildings for 10 or more days without, power, with floodwaters below. A friend of mine on the faculty of Turo, where I was at the time, her mother was stuck in her building in Queens, and she wanted to go to a neighbor's to get some help. She fell down in the stairwell and broke her hip. She was taken to the hospital by, just people in the building in a rowboat. Well, how resilient is it if the residents are going to be taken to the hospital in a rowboat?
I don't understand why companies are willing to insure these buildings, especially if they're new and it's known that these buildings are a flood risk.
Yeah, well, there isn't really a private insurance market because the risk is too great. But the federal government subsidizes insurance for properties in these high-risk flood zones. That's what came out of the 1964 National Flood Insurance Policy Act. The regulations don't in any way move development away from hazard areas, and in fact provide a roadmap for developing hazardous areas, because they say, well, do these things to the buildings, elevate them, flood-proof the bottom floor, make it so your bottom floor walls can snap off when the floodwaters flow through, so the property isn't knocked over.
Wow.
Yeah, and so it's with that we see communities build, be destroyed, get their insurance payout, build, be destroyed, get their insurance payout.
So you said there's an island where this has happened?
Right, but so this island has been basically just flattened by a dozen hurricanes. Then the amount of money that has been spent to respond, right? Not just in payments, so in insurance payments, but also disaster spending and rebuilding costs. Like every resident of this island could have been moved off the island and put in basically like some really nice housing somewhere else. It just illustrates though what's going on everywhere else. You may say that they're being foolish, and maybe they are, but the US government is right there behind them.